The war had burned through the stars for 17 long years. Humanity, small and stubborn, had fought against the mighty Zir Dominion, an empire of cold-blooded conquerors who ruled half the galaxy with claws of steel. Worlds had fallen, cities had been erased, and fleets had vanished in the black. Yet through it all, humanity refused to kneel. They rebuilt from ashes again and again, powered by the same fierce thing that had once carried them from the dirt of Earth to the stars: sheer, unbreakable will. To the Zir, this was madness. To humans, it was survival. When the Zir Emperor Vorthun the Infinite sent word that he desired peace, few believed it. The Emperor was known across the galaxy as a master of deceit. He had ended wars not through mercy but through mockery, by making his enemies destroy themselves. Still, the Terran Council agreed to talks. Their fleets were exhausted, their soldiers weary. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the end. The peace meeting was held aboard the space station Concordia, a neutral ground suspended between the territories of both species. Its silver hull shimmered against the light of a dying red sun, a symbol of fragile hope. Inside, diplomats from both sides filled the grand assembly chamber, their languages mixing in the air like smoke. The Zir arrived in tall black armor, their reptilian faces hidden behind curved masks. The human officers came in clean white uniforms, their eyes alert, their hands never far from their weapons. Everyone knew one spark could set the whole thing ablaze. When Emperor Vorthun finally appeared, the room fell silent. His body was enormous, like a living monument carved from obsidian. His voice, when he spoke, rumbled through the hall. "Let the galaxy witness," he declared, "the union of strength and weakness." At his gesture, a crystal pod floated forward, guarded by Zir soldiers. Its surface glowed faintly with a strange light. Inside was a figure, tall, heavy, and motionless. The pod hissed open with a breath of cold vapor. The being inside stepped forward. She was unlike any creature the humans had seen. Her scales shimmered like molten silver, her eyes deep gold. 4 thick arms hung by her sides, her form large and soft compared to the sharp, wiry frames of most Zir. Her breath came slow and heavy. She lowered her head as though she already carried the weight of the galaxy on her back. Emperor Vorthun spread his claws and smiled. A terrible, thin smile. "Behold," he said mockingly, "my daughter, Princess Thalrina, a gift of alliance. May she join your kind in unity, if your frail bones can support her." A murmur of shock ran through the hall. The insult was clear. In Zir culture, size and strength were symbols of disgrace, of imperfection. To call someone large was to call them unworthy. This was no marriage proposal. It was a slap in the face. The human delegates exchanged uneasy looks. Admiral Yates, leading the Terran delegation, clenched his jaw but said nothing. To respond would mean war. To accept would mean humiliation. Around them, the Zir courtiers whispered cruelly, their laughter sharp as glass. The Emperor's smirk deepened. He had turned diplomacy into theater, and humanity was his audience. But one person in the room was not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a politician. He was a mechanic, a simple ship engineer named Elias Crane. He had been assigned to Concordia to keep the human ships running during the talks, to make sure nothing exploded that shouldn't. He stood at the back of the hall in his grease-stained uniform, hands folded behind his head, wondering why he was even there. He had fought in the early years of the war, fixing warships under fire, losing friends faster than engines. Now he was just trying to keep things working long enough for someone smarter to end the bloodshed. As the Emperor continued his speech, Elias's eyes drifted toward the princess. She stood still beside her father, silent, head slightly bowed. Her massive hands were trembling. He saw something in her face, not arrogance, not cruelty, but sorrow. The kind of sorrow you hide when you've been laughed at your entire life. He didn't see an enemy. He saw someone broken in a way that felt familiar. That night, the Emperor feasted with the ambassadors while the princess was confined to a private chamber for her own safety. The guards outside her door were more like jailers than protectors. Inside, she sat alone, staring at her reflection in the mirrored wall, the reflection of a mistake her father had made flesh. Every breath she took echoed in the empty room. Every beat of her heart was a reminder that she was never meant to be loved, only used. Down in the maintenance bay, Elias was working on a faulty air recycling unit when his monitor flashed red. The princess's chamber was showing low oxygen levels. Typical, he thought. The Zir had brought their own life support tech, and it never integrated well with human systems. He grabbed his toolkit and trudged up the long corridor, muttering under his breath about broken seals and lazy engineers. The guards at the door glared at him but let him through when he showed his badge. Inside, the room was colder than it should have been. He saw her sitting on the floor, motionless. For a moment he thought she was ignoring him until she turned her head slightly. "You are human," she said softly. Her voice was deep but fragile, like someone unused to speaking without fear. Elias crouched beside the wall panel, opening it up with a twist of his wrist. "That's right," he said casually. "And you're breathing air that's about to run out, so if you don't mind, I'll talk while I fix." She watched him work, her golden eyes following every move. "Do humans always speak so easily to those above them?" she asked. Elias chuckled without looking up. "Above me? Lady, I talk to engines all day. You're the first one to talk back." That made her blink in surprise, and maybe, just for a heartbeat, a small, uncertain smile touched her lips. When the air system hummed back to life, Elias sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "There," he said. "Should be stable now." She lowered her gaze and whispered, "Do humans also laugh at the broken?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Nah, we fix them." The silence that followed was heavy but not painful. It was the silence of understanding. Two people who had been thrown aside by larger powers finding a small spark of connection in the dark. Elias stood and slung his tool bag over his shoulder. "Try not to suffocate before breakfast," he said with a grin. "I charge extra for emergency calls." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Elias," she said, his name strange and careful on her tongue. "Thank you." He paused, nodded once without looking back, and walked out. In the corridors beyond, the hum of the station seemed louder. The stars outside burned cold and distant, but for the first time in years, something warm flickered in Elias's chest. He didn't know what it was, pity maybe, or curiosity, or something deeper, something dangerous. He only knew that she wasn't what her father said she was. And somehow he knew this wasn't the end of their story. Up in his private suite, Emperor Vorthun watched the station through a wall of glass, sipping from a goblet of liquid light. To him, everything was going according to plan. The humans had been insulted beyond repair, their pride wounded. Soon they would lash out and he would have his excuse to destroy them completely. The war would end not with peace but with their extinction. He smiled in satisfaction. He did not notice that his daughter's chamber no longer showed as isolated on his control board. He did not see the faint human life sign recorded near her, the mechanic who had just changed everything. Far below, in the quiet of the maintenance levels, Elias sat beside a humming generator staring at his hands. He thought of her question. Do humans laugh at the broken? He had laughed once, years ago, when the war still felt like a game. But now, after watching so many friends die, so many machines break and burn, he knew laughter didn't fix anything. What fixed things was work, effort, refusal to give up. That was what humans did best. And maybe, he thought, maybe that's what she needed. Someone who didn't see her as a joke or a burden, but as something worth fixing. In the quiet hum of the machine room, surrounded by the endless pulse of metal and power, Elias Crane made a decision. He didn't know it yet, but it would change the fate of two species. He would not stand by and let another broken thing be thrown away. He would fix her. And in doing so, he might just fix the galaxy. 3 days after the Emperor's cruel gift, the halls of Concordia felt different. The diplomats still smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hides fear. The air tasted like tension, and every sound echoed too long. The Zir guard stood taller than before, their claws resting close to their weapons while the human officers whispered about ships that hadn't checked in. Something was wrong. Everyone felt it, even if no one dared to speak it aloud. Princess Thalrina had not left her quarters since the day Elias had fixed her air system, though the humans noticed that her chamber light stayed on late into the night. She spent her hours staring through the viewport, watching the endless stars. She thought about her father's smirk, about how he had used her as a tool to humiliate others, about how her whole life had been one long, quiet punishment. The only kindness she had known came from a human mechanic who talked to her like she was real. That small spark in her heart, warm and unfamiliar, kept her from sinking completely into despair. She wondered if humans always looked so fragile because they carried so much strength inside. While the diplomats prepared for another round of empty words, Elias was on the engineering deck, checking power lines and fusion cores. He hadn't seen her since that night, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. She was an alien princess, and he was a grease-stained mechanic. But his thoughts always drifted back to her eyes. Those sad golden eyes that had looked at him not as a human or a soldier, but as someone who listened. He had seen broken ships, shattered armor, burned-out engines, but never someone who looked broken on the inside and still managed to stand tall. He admired that, maybe even more than he should. When the alarms blared that morning, Elias was the first to notice something strange. The signal wasn't an accident alert. It was a war code. Up in the conference chamber, Emperor Vortun stood before the Terran Council, his voice calm, his claws folded behind his back. He spoke of peace through obedience, in a phrase that made every human diplomat stiffen. Then the screens lit up around the room. Images appeared. Planetary feeds from human colonies, Vega Prime, Titan Station, Ceres Base, all burning. Fire streaked across their skies. Zir warships, massive and black, poured plasma onto cities filled with millions of civilians. The Emperor watched the horror play across the humans' faces and smiled like a man enjoying fine art. "My fleet," he said softly, "moves faster than your diplomats." Gasps filled the room. "You call this peace?" Admiral Yates shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You've slaughtered innocent lives." The Emperor's voice grew cold and cruel. "Do not mistake mercy for weakness. Your kind has crawled too far into the stars. You will now learn to crawl back." Then with a gesture of his hand, he ordered his soldiers to seize the station. The Zur guards turned on their human counterparts instantly. Blades hissed out, energy rifles fired, and chaos erupted in the Grand Hall. The Emperor's laughter thundered above it all. Concordia, built to symbolize peace, became a battlefield in seconds. Down in the lower decks, Elias felt the impact of explosions. Lights flickered, metal groaned, and the floor shook beneath his boots. Over the comms, terrified voices screamed for backup. He grabbed his plasma torch and sprinted toward the hangar bays, knowing he couldn't fight. But maybe he could fly. If the ships were still operational, he could help people escape. As he ran through the smoke-filled corridors, a massive figure burst through a side wall, sending debris flying. It was Thalrina. Her scales were scratched, her eyes blazing with fury. In one arm, she carried the broken body of a Zir guard. She dropped him to the floor and turned to Elias, breathing hard. "He lied," she growled. "He always lies." Elias could barely catch his breath. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Your father's men—" She cut him off with a bitter laugh. "They are not my men. I will not kill for him anymore." Behind her, the corridor shuddered again as another blast rocked the station. Elias pointed toward the hangar. "Come on, we have a ship. If we move fast, we can fight or run." For the first time since she'd been sent here, Thalrina nodded with purpose instead of shame. Together, they sprinted through the crumbling halls. The humans they passed stared in shock, a Zir princess fighting with them, but there was no time for questions. When they reached the hangar, Elias's heart sank. Most ships were destroyed, their hulls split open by gunfire. Only one corvette remained intact, though its left engine was smoking. The Starbreaker, a Terran assault craft that had taken heavy damage days earlier. Elias had been fixing her systems before the talks began. "We can fly her," he said. "Barely." Thalrina studied the vessel, her forearms flexing. "Then we make her ready." She marched toward the ship and began tearing away twisted metal by hand, her strength bending alloy like thin wire. Elias climbed into the cockpit, working faster than he ever had. Sparks flew as he rewired power lines, sweat stinging his eyes. He shouted through the comm line, "We'll need shields and weapons online. Can you handle that?" Her reply came through the static. "I was born in war." When she slammed her claws down on the control panel, the Starbreaker roared to life. The hangar doors opened to the vacuum of space, and for the first time in her life, Thalrina felt free. Outside, the battle was pure chaos. Human ships were falling one after another, tiny explosions blinking like dying stars. The Zir fleet outnumbered them 10-1. The Emperor's voice echoed across the channels, mocking both sides. "Look how easily they burn. Humanity was never worthy of the stars." Elias gritted his teeth. "He talks too much," he muttered. "Let's shut him up." Thalrina took the gunner's seat, her forearms gripping the controls. When she fired, the ship's cannons lit up the void with white fire. Zir fighters exploded under the storm. Elias flew the Starbreaker through clouds of debris, weaving between enemy blasts with impossible precision. Every time their shields flickered, she rerouted power with inhuman speed. Every time their engines overheated, he kicked them back to life. Together, they moved like a single heartbeat. Across the fleet, human captains saw the strange sight of a Terran corvette led by a Zir princess, tearing through the enemy lines like a comet of vengeance. The sight spread hope where none had been left. Admiral Yates's ship caught their signal, and his voice came through the comm. "All units rally on the Starbreaker." Follow their lead. One by one, the remaining human ships formed up behind them. The battle turned. Human missiles pierced Zir destroyers. Plasma fire rained across the enemy formation, and for the first time that day, the humans were pushing back. Thalrina shouted over the roar of the engines, "They will not stop! He will destroy us all." Elias glanced at her. Then we hit harder. Hours passed in a blur of light and fire. They fought until the stars themselves seemed to fade. Finally, silence began to fall. The Zir fleet broke apart, retreating in confusion. The humans cheered across every channel. But their victory was short-lived, for out of the dark came a shadow larger than all the rest, a warship the size of a small moon. The Vorthun Eternal, the Emperor's flagship. Its surface bristled with weapons and shields, its core glowing like a sun. The Emperor's voice returned, colder and louder than before. "You think this is victory? You have merely entertained me. Now, you will see the true face of power." Elias looked at the readings and felt his stomach twist. No ship in the human fleet could stand against something that size. But when he turned to Thalrina, he saw no fear in her face, only resolve. "He has ruled through fear all his life," she said quietly. "It ends now." Elias nodded, though his hands trembled. "Then we end it together." The Starbreaker limped toward the massive ship, its hull scarred and burning, its crew of 2 running on nothing but fury and faith. The other Terran vessels followed at a distance, watching as the small corvette vanished into the shadow of the Emperor's flagship. The humans didn't know if they would come back. All they knew was that for the first time in history, a human and a Zir fought side by side, not for conquest, not for revenge, but for something bigger, for a chance to be free of fear. As the stars flared behind them and the Emperor's ship loomed ahead like a god of death, Elias tightened his grip on the controls. "Hold on, Princess," he said with a half-smile. "This is going to hurt." She bared her teeth in a fierce grin. "Then let it hurt." And with that, they flew straight into the heart of the enemy's darkness. The Starbreaker shuddered as it tore through the endless dark toward the Emperor's flagship. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, sparks flying from damaged panels, and the engines screamed as Elias pushed them beyond their limits. Every alarm was blaring, every warning light flashing red, but he didn't slow down. The massive warship ahead of them, Vorthun Eternal, filled the entire sky, a mountain of metal and fury that blocked the stars. It was more fortress than vessel, built from the broken remains of conquered worlds. Its surface glowed with rivers of molten energy, and at its heart pulsed the Emperor's core, a reactor said to be alive, fused with his own essence. Elias knew they couldn't win this battle the normal way. They were a single corvette, battered and half dead, facing a god in armor. But he had never believed in gods. He believed in grit, in hands that built and bled and never stopped working. He looked at Thalrina beside him, her silver scales scorched and cracked, her breathing shallow. Yet her eyes burned with something fierce, determination mixed with sorrow. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, even though both of them knew there was no other choice. She turned to him and smiled, a sad but proud smile. "All my life I have been his shame," she said softly. "Now I will be his end." As the Starbreaker approached the outer shield, enemy fire rained down upon them. Beams of plasma sliced past, each one bright enough to blind, each one carrying the heat of a star. Elias jerked the controls, twisting the ship into a rolling dive. Metal screamed. One beam hit their rear engine, and the ship jolted so hard he thought the frame would tear apart. Warning lights went white, systems died, and for a few seconds they drifted helplessly. Thalrina didn't hesitate. She unbuckled herself, stormed into the engine bay, and began repairing the damage by hand. Her claws sparked as she tore out burnt conduits and forced the energy lines to reconnect. The ship roared back to life, engines burning blue again. She shouted from the back, "Go!" While it still breathes. Elias grinned despite the chaos. "You're starting to sound like a human," he yelled and slammed the thrusters forward. The Starbreaker shot through the flickering shield, cutting into the belly of the Emperor's ship. The impact was brutal. The Corvette crashed into the hangar bay, smashing through the deck plating and scattering Zir soldiers like insects. The lights exploded and fire bloomed in all directions. Elias coughed smoke, grabbed his blaster and stumbled out of the cockpit. Thalrina was already there, standing tall amid the flames. Her armor cracked but her spirit unbroken. When the first wave of soldiers charged, she met them head-on, roaring so loud it shook the walls. Her forearms moved like lightning, crushing weapons, shattering armor, sending enemies flying. Elias covered her from behind, firing at anything that moved. Together they fought their way through the burning corridors, heading toward the ship's central reactor. Each step forward felt like walking deeper into hell. Alarms screamed. Fire rained from the ceiling. The walls bled sparks, but nothing stopped them. The humans watching from their distant ships saw the Vorthun Eternal flicker and shake. And though they didn't know what was happening inside, they whispered a single word over and over, hope, at last. They reached the heart of the ship, a vast chamber filled with energy conduits and molten light. In the center hovered the Emperor himself, surrounded by golden armor that seemed to move like liquid. He looked like a god carved from flame, his many eyes glowing with cruel pride. His voice filled the chamber, low and thunderous. "Daughter," he said, his tone dripping with disgust, "you shame your bloodline by siding with these vermin." Thalrina lifted her head, meeting his gaze without fear. "I side with the living," she said. "You only serve death." The Emperor laughed, the sound echoing like thunder across the chamber. "You think these humans care for you? You are their monster now, their weapon. You are nothing to them." Elias stepped forward, his voice sharp and steady. "Wrong, she's everything we fight for. The right to choose who we are." The Emperor turned toward him, and for a moment his laughter stopped. "A mechanic," he sneered. "A builder of broken things." Elias's lips curved into a small smile. "That's right. And today I'm fixing the galaxy." The battle that followed was chaos turned into art. The Emperor struck with a spear of molten energy, a weapon that could pierce through starship hulls. Thalrina met him with her bare claws, catching the blade and holding it back as sparks flew around them. The heat seared her flesh, but she didn't let go. Elias darted through the chamber, dodging debris, trying to reach the control core where the reactor systems were linked. The Emperor twisted his weapon and threw Thalrina across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening sound but forced herself up again, her breath ragged. "You cannot kill what is eternal," the Emperor roared. Elias at the reactor terminal shouted back, "Then let's make you mortal again." He began overriding the ship's failsafe systems, forcing the core to overload. Lights dimmed. The energy pulsed faster. The whole ship began to shake. The Emperor realized what Elias was doing and turned his fury on him, charging forward like a storm. Thalrina leapt between them, taking the blow meant for Elias. The spear drove through her chest, glowing bright as fire. She gasped but held onto the weapon with both hands, trapping it in her body so he couldn't pull it free. Blood like molten silver ran down her scales. "Now," she shouted, her voice breaking. Elias's hands flew across the console, his eyes burning with tears and fury. The reactor screamed as it reached critical mass. "We have to go," he yelled. But she was already falling to her knees. She looked up at him, her face soft despite the pain. "You fix me," she whispered. He dropped to her side, pulling her close, his hands trembling. "We can still make it," he said desperately. "I'll get you out." She shook her head weakly. "Too late. But it's all right." Her eyes met his, glowing faintly in the red light. "Live, Elias. Live for both of us." He wanted to argue, to fight fate itself, but the ship was breaking apart around them. He pressed his forehead against hers. "You were never broken," he whispered. "You were perfect." She smiled, her last breath leaving her lips like a sigh, and then she was gone. The explosion that followed was brighter than a sunrise. The Vorthun Eternal split open from its core, fire tearing through its body, ripping it apart from the inside. The blast lit up the void, so powerful it blinded every sensor across the fleet. Human and Zir ships alike were thrown off course, their shields buckling under the shockwave. When the light finally faded, the Emperor's flagship was gone, nothing left but fragments of burning metal drifting silently through space. The humans stared in awe and disbelief. They didn't know who had done it or how, but they knew what it meant. The war was over. The Emperor was dead. The unbreakable dominion had fallen. Days later, salvage crews combed through the wreckage. Most found nothing but twisted steel and silence. But one team discovered a single stasis pod floating among the debris. Inside was a Zur female, barely alive but breathing. It was Thalrina. Somehow the energy of the explosion had triggered the emergency stasis around her body. When she awoke weeks later in a medical chamber orbiting Earth, she was weak but alive. The first thing she saw was a worn mechanic's jacket hanging near her bed. Elias's jacket stained with grease and blood. Someone had salvaged it from the wreck. She reached out and touched it with shaking hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You really did fix me," she whispered softly to the empty room. In the years that followed, Princess Thalrina became something more than either species had ever imagined. She served as the first Zir ambassador to the Terran coalition. Walking among the very humans her father had called vermin, she spoke of unity born from courage, of peace built by hands that once knew only war. When she stood before the United Stellar Council for the first time, she wore that same mechanic's jacket over her armor like a flag. The humans honored her as a hero, and the Zir, ashamed of what their emperor had done, followed her lead. Whenever new worlds looked up at the night sky, they could see the light of the Vorthun Eternal's wreckage still orbiting the old battle zone, glowing faintly like a scar across the stars. People told stories of the human mechanic and the alien princess who changed the fate of two species. And somewhere in those stories, one truth always remained the same. Humanity, no matter how small or fragile, could turn even an insult into hope, even an enemy into family. Because humans didn't just fight, they fixed. They rebuilt. They endured. And in the end, that was what made them unstoppable.